Tony Siragusa. It bears repeating. He said, I tell these guys, don't give me any of that wait till next year stuff because I may not be here next year. He said, no one here is on a scholarship.
Let me set the scene for you. It's January 28th, 2001, and the clock is just about to strike 9:51 p.m. here in Tampa's Raymond James Stadium. Standing here is the crowd on hand for the waning minutes of Super Bowl 35. That crowd is preparing to see the Baltimore Ravens win their first championship in franchise history.
There were so many players on the defense that copied the Ravens' way.
Barber. Looks like he's short of a first down, but time will run out. Or at least the clock is now stopped with 3 seconds to play, but people are charging the field. Jerry Austin winds the clock, and that will bring Super Bowl 35 to an end.
With a final 3-yard rush from Tiki Barber swallowed up by the monstrous Ravens defense, the clock now shows triple zeros. Baltimore has won and will soon receive a Lombardi trophy in just their 5th year of existence. One player that's been there for all 5 of those years, said to hold another award, as Ray Lewis is named Super Bowl MVP. Let's check in and see if he has any plans now that he has won the Super Bowl.
What are you going to do next? I'm going to Disney World!
If you've never heard Ray Lewis before, I'm going to take a page out of the playbook of U.S. Senator Lloyd Bentsen. Listener, I rooted for Ray Lewis. I watched Ray Lewis. That voice is no Ray Lewis. While it is typically the Super Bowl MVP who got to utter those 5 famous words anytime they won the big game, Ray Lewis wasn't exactly the squeaky clean spokesman that a company like Disney wanted. Because a year ago, Ray got in a little bit of trouble. I'm going to take a page out of someone else's book, this time John Mulaney, who met Ray Lewis while he was writing some commercials featuring the star for the Madden video game series, and later described what Ray Lewis is famous for off the field as being within stabbing distance of a couple guys that got stabbed.
So instead, cameras had approached the quarterback that had just led the Ravens to a 34-7 victory, Trent Dilfer. But to say he had led the team might be a bit of an overstatement. Dilfer was a midseason replacement who only started 8 games in the regular season, though he did go 7-1 as a starter. This wasn't him saving it for the playoffs. In 4 games that postseason, he went just 35 of 73 for 590 yards, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception. In both the playoffs as a whole and this game, in which he went 12 for 25 with a single score, Dilfer posted a sub-50% completion rate. In fact, with the pick 6 and kickoff return touchdown, the defense and special teams not only outscored the Giants on their own, they outscored their own offense. This was, in layman's terms, a very bad game for Trent Dilfer, and it wasn't an anomaly. Looking at the regular season passer rating for all 69, nice, of the quarterbacks in the Super Bowl era to have started at least 8 games for a team that had made the Super Bowl as of this game, Dilfer's 76.6 ranks 58th. The only quarterback from that decade ranked lower is Tony Banks, the guy that Dilfer replaced midseason in Baltimore. There were worse quarterbacks, to be sure, that had made the big game, and worse ones to have even won it all. But as the subsequent decades would prove, the era in which you could get away with this was quickly coming to a close. Dilfer would never take another snap for the Ravens as they signed his replacement, Elvis Grbac, just 5 weeks later. He would never appear in another Super Bowl, and his performance that year is as much of a time capsule as the 2001 halftime performance by the Backstreet Boys, Nelly, Britney Spears, and NSYNC. But it wasn't just Trent Dilfer who disappeared from the big game. Over the next decade, the playoffs, and especially the Super Bowl, became more or less exclusive domain for a new tier of quarterbacks putting up perennially MVP caliber play, heretofore unseen in the sport. The AFC ceded completely to the duo of Tom Brady and Peyton Manning, with an occasional Ben Roethlisberger jump scare. And the NFC saw the rise and fall of future Hall of Famers like Brett Favre, Donovan McNabb, Drew Brees, and Aaron Rodgers. And Eli Manning snuck in there that one time.
Strong defenses certainly didn't disappear. We've documented before on the show how the Eagles-Bucks 1995 draft day trade set the stage for a Tampa D that would manage to win their franchise's first Lombardi just 2 years after Baltimore. But the more time marched on from that January 2001 evening, the more it became clear. Top-tier quarterback play was no longer just one of the many ways a team could win a title. It was a prerequisite. That could help explain the fortune of those Baltimore Ravens. In the 11 years since that Super Bowl win, their strong defense certainly didn't disappear. Ray Lewis is still here. In fact, they've since added Hall of Famer Ed Reed and regular Pro Bowl attendees Terrell Suggs and Haloti Ngata, among others. But one person who didn't last was Trent Dilfer's replacement, Elvis Grbac. Just 1 year into his 5-year contract, Baltimore cut him, but things haven't gotten much better. They got even worse initially, with stopgap, quote-unquote solutions, such as Jeff Blake and Chris Redman, but eventually they stabilized a little as Kyle Bowler and Steve McNair each at least managed to make the playoffs. However, each of those runs ended with a home playoff loss. The gap between the Ravens and the AFC aristocracy was the size of approximately one MVP-level signal caller, and no one had been able to close that gap. Yet.
But then something happened. Someone arrived. And now, a little bit more than 11 years after Trent Dilfer told the world of his post-game vacation plans, the Baltimore Ravens find themselves in the Superdome in New Orleans, once again on the precipice of history. Since 2008, this team's core has slowly built to this crescendo, and the conductor for nearly every one of the snaps for those games is ready to line up under center for the biggest moment of his life. Both he and this team have become a kind of Rorschach test for fans during this run, this source of constant debate, even as he continues a sterling playoff run to this point, capping an already incredibly impressive postseason resume. And with one final emphatic stamp today, he can finally end that debate once and for all. The Ravens can finally prove that they and their young quarterback, Joe Flacco, are, in a word, elite. Joe Flacco. Really? That is a fair question. He is not the best or most successful quarterback of his generation. There's probably not going to be a bust of his very large forehead in Canton anytime soon, with all due respect. He's not also some one-team legend who altered some franchise's identity and is destined to remember as an eternal one-jersey guy. So why Joe Flacco? There's a very roundabout answer to that.
Football is a uniquely American sport. Any European can tell you that in the middle of saying it's not real football. Baseball may be our national pastime, but between Latin America and the Caribbean, Japan, Korea, it's a sport that has found purchase worldwide over the past 2 centuries or so. But with the exception of the NFL's northern counterpart, the CFL, as well as some false starts elsewhere in the world like the World League of American Football, football has remained contained to the shores of the United States. And left to its own devices in this isolated petri dish, it has undergone perhaps the most dramatic and fundamental changes of any major professional sport during its lifetime. If you were to travel back in time to the late 1800s to bring a baseball fan to the present day, they might be a little confused about what they were seeing. The speed of the pitches, the distance of fly balls, the fact that everyone on all the teams is white. It's not a one-to-one comparison to be sure. But give them an inning or two, and they would likely be able to follow the game as well as anyone from modern day. A hockey fan from the early 20th century might wonder why goalies wear masks. A basketball fan would need to learn about the three-point line and shot clock. And a soccer fan would probably have a conniption if you tried to explain VAR to them. But it's genuinely incredible to consider how many of these sports still so closely hew to their original forms.
And then there's football, a sport where even the ball itself is unrecognizable when compared to its original form. Long before the century plus of history that the NFL claims, the game began on a college field in the great state of New Jersey. There, on Saturday, November 6th, 1869, what a nice year it was, Rutgers and Princeton squared off in New Brunswick, with Rutgers winning by a score of 6-4. If that final score is any indication, this simply was not football as we know it now, still resembling more of a bastardized rugby at the time based on contemporary accounts. But football, those 2 words, was what they put in the papers, and everything needs to start somewhere. The sport quickly caught on with many of the future Ivy League colleges like Princeton, Columbia, Harvard, and Yale. And beginning in the 1870s, it found one of its first great players and innovators in Walter Camp of Yale. Walter Camp had been a star for the Bulldogs for 6 entire years from 1876 until 1882, with Yale claiming a national title in the sport for every single one of those seasons. But even more important than his role on the field was his role off of it, as he became a regular participant in the series of meetings convened by the 4 future Ivies to continue determining the growth and future of their nation's sport. With each subsequent one of these conventions, the game got closer and closer to what we recognize as today's football. And the first major problem was what to do with these massive scrums. They'd started out initially having 15 players on either side, just as in rugby, and one of the first changes was to reduce it to 11 apiece. Next, Camp pushed for the establishment of a line of scrimmage from which individual, discrete plays would commence one at a time, as opposed to the continuous play of rugby that only ended with a score. Now, the newly created center position would gently kick the ball back with their feet to begin play, and the player ready to receive it needed a new title too: quarterback.
This is where that title first appears. This is still very much not the quarterback as we know it. Most formations of 11 players had 7 players at the line and 4 lined up behind it, leading to the suffix back getting appended to those 4 quote-unquote positions. But rather than these indicating any kind of differentiation in either skill set or role in the game, these names are mostly just there to describe literally how far back the player was from this newfangled line of scrimmage. Furthest from the line was the tailback. Then as you got closer, you got the fullback, the halfback, and finally the quarterback closest to the line right behind the center. One similarity between then and now is the quarterback's business took place behind the line of scrimmage exclusively. But that business at this time was mostly just receiving the ball from the center and handing off to one of the other backs to then run with. 20 years after the first game, we finally have the first proper football snap. Yale center Bert Hansen became the first recorded player to bend over and bounce the ball between his legs to his quarterback. Evolution picked up speed as just 5 years later, with football beginning to spread to the Great Lakes regions where so much of the NFL's history would eventually take root, another innovation came from the college ranks thanks to the University of Chicago. Leading the powerhouse at the time was coach Amos Alonzo Stagg, who had the idea to move the quarterback closer to the line to stand in an upright position. Now he would have a better vantage point of what the defense was showing, and this is still at the time just in the interest of knowing which one of the backs to hand it off to for a rush. But we are getting closer to the quarterback as we know it with every evolutionary step.
While this cut down on the violent scrums of the early game, it didn't eliminate them. And given sports' tendency to move towards bigger, faster, and stronger players at all times, the brutality returned in even greater force in the coming decade or so. The Chicago Tribune reported in 1905 that 18 college football players had died in the previous season, with an additional 137 serious injuries during that same period. None other than legendary sports fan and President of the United States Teddy Roosevelt is apocryphally quoted as having demanded that football change its rules or be abolished, going on to say, brutality and foul play should receive the same summary punishment given to a man who cheats at cards. Change the game or forsake it. Shortly thereafter, yet another one of the football legislatures was convened, and amongst other changes adopted regarding things like first down distance, rules regarding the forward pass were finally codified. Our buddy Walter Camp may have actually been the first person to attempt a pass back in 1876 in his first ever game. Accounts of the first ever Thanksgiving football game, played between Yale and Princeton that year, told of him throwing the ball forward to teammate Oliver Thompson as he was tackled. However, no rule existed regarding it at the time, and when Princeton protested the play, the referee only decided to let it stand due to the capricious result of a coin flip.
30 years later, though, people like Camp and Chicago's coach Stagg weren't the biggest fans of the play that they feared would reduce football to a parlor game. The person pushing for the rule's inclusion was a different and probably more recognizable name, John Heisman, who'd been advocating for the pass's inclusion since 1903. And since that crusade of his began, he had met one last important historical figure in the development of the pass, his successor as coach of Clemson University, a guy by the name of Eddie Cockums. Cockums, who had moved on to St. Louis University after a year with the Clemson Tigers, had discussed the finer points of the forward pass with Heisman for some time prior to the 1906 season. But without any guidelines regarding the play, it had remained little more than a theoretical discussion. But with the rule changes set to take place, Cockums and his players prepared for the upcoming season with an unheard of at the time 2-month training camp in Wisconsin for, in his own words, the sole purpose of studying and developing the pass. In particular, he had a recent transfer to SLU's med school, Bradbury Robinson, who'd once seen a teammate in Wisconsin during his undergrad years manage to throw the ball nearly as far as Robinson himself could punt it. Robinson's teammate had discovered, much as Cockums would during that training camp, that despite the oblong and awkward shape of the football, there was a way to manage its flight through the air. By placing one's fingers in the laces used to hold the leather together and flicking your wrist as you threw, a spiral could be achieved that would let you, as Robinson put it, throw the danged thing 40 yards. Robinson would be the first of a line of players with hands like steam shovels that Cockums would recruit over the years to handle the ball. And on September 5th, 1906, Robinson connected with teammate Jack Schneider with the first ever overhead projectile spiral pass. Cockums and SLU ran roughshod over the competition that year, winning that September 5th game against Carroll College by a whopping 22-0 margin. As it is now, football was a sport where innovation will always be copied, and with this proof of concept for the play's ability to dominate opponents, the forward pass was here to stay.
So, great, RTG, that's cool history and all, but once again, what does any of this have to do with Joe Flacco? Well, football positions are incredibly specialized. With the exception of trick plays, linemen aren't going to line up wide, running backs aren't going to snap the ball, and unless you're Randall Cunningham or George Blanda, a punter is not typically going to throw the ball. And the development of the forward pass is what leads to that specialization. This incredibly specific skill begets all of the subsequent positions that all pivot around this one focal point of the offense and the subsequent evolution of playbooks and schemes. The location of the quarterback behind the line of scrimmage is what gives the position its name, but the forward pass is what makes the position of quarterback what it is today. And as for why Flacco, it had taken 40 years for a violent rugby variant to start at least kind of resembling the different violent sport we have today. But with the development of the pass, a semblance of stability in the sport took hold for much of the remainder of the 1900s. Football as a business changed, sure. No longer was this just a college pastime. This was a large and increasingly larger every year pro-enterprise. But going back to our time-traveling football fans, one from 1906 could probably at least follow a game from the back half of the 20th century with maybe a little help. Now, though, as we approach the turn of another century, new massive sea changes begin to take place in the sport, both on the field and in the way that we as a sports-crazed public consumed it. It is the opinion of this podcast that while there might be bigger names or personalities or faces that we have come to associate with this period, the story of Joe Flacco is the story of 21st century football. And this story, much like the story of football as a whole, once again begins in the great state of New Jersey.
The state of New Jersey has several things in abundance. Gas station attendants, places Bruce Springsteen has mentioned in songs, and small towns. Or townships, or boroughs, because New Jersey actually has so many of these little population centers that there are 12 possible forms of municipal government that they can adopt. Camden County has a number of these, and that's where much of this parochial story will take place. And within Camden County, it will more specifically start in Haddon Township with two athletic standouts, Karen Madden and Stephen Flacco. The Maddens and Flaccos were part of the local sporting institution at the time. Their fathers hadn't just both played football at nearby Camden Catholic High, they'd actually been teammates. Joe's grandfather, the original Joe Flacco, as the family calls him, played tight end at Camden Catholic High School, where he caught passes from quarterback Tom Madden before both graduated in 1954 and remained in the area to raise their own families. The families connected yet again when Stephen and Karen began dating in high school, during which time they both excelled as multi-sport athletes on the hardwood and the diamond for the Haddon Hawks. but it's Steven's last sport, football, that would give him a chance to continue his academic pursuits just 20 minutes down the road at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia.
The Quakers and Ivy League football as a whole suffered a major embarrassment during Flacco's time in Philadelphia. These Ivy Leagues were the schools at the center of almost all of Camp and Company's innovations in the late 19th century at the beginning of the sport's history. But that history was becoming increasingly ancient as the college football landscape shifted over the decades of the 20th century. Schools that prided themselves as elite institutions tended to maintain quote-unquote elite academic standards. And as the years went on, they saw a smaller and smaller pool of players who could keep up in the classroom and also keep up with the increased level of competition on the field. And now, here, in 1982, the ultimate insult. A demotion from Division 1A, now known as the FBS Football Bowl Subdivision, to the much less prestigious 1AA, now known as the Football Championship Subdivision. We'll get more into that distinction later, but for now, let's say that they got sent back down to the minors in a manner of speaking. A black eye for the Ivies to be sure, but Penn wasn't done taking cheap shots heading into the season. There was still time to get picked by Penthouse Magazine of all publications to finish as one of the 20 worst colleges for the upcoming season. Expectations were low. There seems to be this thing, though, with the Flaccos. Let us explain. Steve wasn't a star with the Quakers by any means, and the team had just gone 1-9 the previous season under returning head coach Jerry Burnt. That offseason, Coach Burnt brought the team together and inspired enough confidence to effect a turnaround that has spurred Penn on to a 4-0 start and one of the school's best seasons in decades. They've become a top draw in the city because if this sudden change in fortunes wasn't already enough to grab the football-loving Philadelphia's attention, there's another factor. A lack of anything else to watch. Following week 2 of the regular season, NFL players followed through on their threatened plans to go on strike. And from September 21st on, the league's calendar grinded to a halt with 0 games. For the bird-crazed Philadelphia crowd, there couldn't have been a riper time for the surprising Burnt-coached Quakers to catch the city by storm. Hell, they even got the Eagles announcer Merrill Reese to call their games this season. When these players wake up on November 13th, 1982, they sit at 6-2 with a chance to claim their first share of a conference title in over 23 years. The NFL is still on hold, and with the Harvard Crimson coming to town, the Quakers prepare for the program's biggest game in decades.
And now this is where we see the very first hint that maybe there's something about the bright lights for the Flaccos. With 34,746 fans on hand at Penn's Franklin Field, the Quakers start the day off with this taking the form of another apparent beatdown over the Crimson. Just a minute and 41 into the fourth quarter, none other than Stephen Flacco himself plunged into the end zone to put Penn up 20-0 after the extra point, seemingly the dagger score. And then a little bit more than 10 minutes later, they trailed 21-20. 3 unanswered scores by Harvard had not just brought the Crimson all the way back, but put them ahead and put Penn on their heels. Penn gets the ball back one last time, and quarterback Gary Vera begins to mount a final drive for the Quakers in an attempt to reach field goal territory. After getting past midfield, and knowing that they are sending kicker Dave Shulman out to face some stiff winds, Vera has one last chance in the waning seconds to at least close the distance a little bit more. And who does he see open along the right sideline? None other than, once again, halfback Stephen Flacco, who makes the catch and picks up 13 yards on the play, bring them all the way up to the 20.
10 seconds left. Penn leads about 15 yards. Gary Burek rolling, being chased, fires a pass, completes the pass, and being taken down at the 20-yard line. 3 seconds left. Flacco at the 20, and the Quakers are not going to let this game go. David Shulman is going to come onto the field and try the biggest kick of his life.
Now, admittedly, Flacco's heroics there do not end the game. That's going to fall to Shulman, who actually misses his first attempt, but thankfully a mulligan on a roughing the kicker penalty allows him to finish the game-winning drive and close the book on the miracle on 33rd Street. Stephen Flacco has just demonstrated something that sparks debate regardless of the sport or the level of competition, and that's the concept of clutch. On its face, maybe this is a dumb assertion. Again, he is not the star player for this team, And he scored earlier in the game, but he really only had the one play on the game-winning drives. What about Vera or Schulman or wideout Rich Cyrek, who helped close the distance? What about the fact that this team then lost their regular season finale to Cornell and were one of 3 teams to claim a share of the conference title that season? Can you really claim that this one play proves that Stephen Flacco is clutch, or if clutchness is even something we should be discussing in the first place? Well, all of this is contextual. Is the 13-yard catch and run all that big of a deal on its own? No. But what if it captured turnaround from 1-9 to conference champions for only the second time in school history? What if this is the win that sparked a run of 5 more conference titles by decade's end, with a record 11 more leading up to present day? What if it was the only football that a sports-starved Philadelphia had during that cold 1982 autumn, and the voice of the Eagles himself made the thrilling call? It's starting to sound clutch now?
Context is everything. That's true here in 1982, and it will be true with everything else we talk about throughout the next half-century. No athlete gets a chance to be a hero without everyone and everything that put them in that position in the first place having already worked together in harmony to produce the necessary conditions for heroism. Stephen Flacco could not have made that moment happen on his own, but he did make it happen. Much of what we'll discuss in this series is subjective, and this is by no means the last time that you, dear listener, and we here at RTG Productions may have to agree to disagree. In the interest of continuing our story, let's just say that Stephen Flacco does indeed have the clutch gene deep in his DNA. Well, he's graduated now as of 1983, married his high school sweetheart Karen, and moved back to New Jersey to start a family. And that means it's time for him to pass on that clutch gene to the next generation of Flaccos. And on January 16th, 1985, the new generation of Flaccos begins with their firstborn son, Joe.
By 1994, the Flacco household had seen some changes. For one, the household was now in nearby Audubon, New Jersey, named for the famed American ornithologist, Go Birds. And the other big change was how much bigger the household itself had gotten. Stephen and Karen now had 6 kids, with Joe joined by brothers Mike, John, Brian, and Tom, and sister Stephanie. With so many of them running around under the same roof, they all eventually channeled that into one sport or another, and the boys in particular all followed in their father's footsteps and took up the long-time passion of his that he had kept up with all throughout school and college: baseball. That, at this time, was what Stephen Flacco felt comfortable with his sons playing for hours in the batting cage that the family built in their backyard, and it wasn't until Joe reached 7th grade that he finally got the chance to officially step onto a football field for the first time. With having started so late, Flacco found himself in an awkward position in that he didn't really have a position. Almost every kid playing football dreams of being a star quarterback, but by the time he finally got to join a team, that spot was already filled by several kids who had been learning and playing the position for years. Coaches tried him out at running back, tight end, receiver, just about every other non-lineman position on the offense. But Flacco knew from all his years throwing off a mound at this point in baseball that he had a cannon for an arm. His father called it Godzilla-like, and Joe would regularly display it in practices with his dad on football fields, where Stephen would challenge him to split the uprights with a pass from the 50-yard line. If only he could get a chance to show it off. Well, one thing that is going to open some doors for you is hitting a growth spurt that makes you 6'2" entering high school. After finally getting a chance to shine on the JV squad for his freshman season with this new kind of prototypical quarterback build, it was time to spend the next 3 years at Audubon High writing his name in the region's record books.
Speaking of the region and of history books being written around this time, let's talk about birds again. Growing up, Joe and the Flaccos were a half hour away from the Philadelphia Eagles. And for the first few years of Joe's life, the guy under center for the Philadelphia Eagles was Ron Jaws Jaworski. Jaws and Flacco actually shared the same official birthplace of Voorhees, New Jersey. And while he'd spent some time in Los Angeles after being drafted by the Rams, a swap for all-pro tight end Charlie Young brought him back to his ancestral homeland, where he would spend a decade from 1977 to 1986 as the signal caller for the Birds. This ended up being great value for the Eagles. Dick Vermeil made Jaws his full-time starter and was immediately rewarded with a season in which he threw for 2,183 yards. Now that may be a pittance in the modern game, but it was the 7th highest total for the entire 1977 season. Vermeil and Jaws would work alongside other offensive stars like Hall of Famer Harold Carmichael and Pro Bowler Wilbert Montgomery to reach the playoffs in 4 of their first 5 seasons together, even making it to the Super Bowl in Super Bowl 15 for the 1980 season. But much like Trent Dilfer decades later, Jaworski was going to get swept up by the tides of change. The 2,183 yards that Jaworski put up in 1977 would be the lowest he ever put up for a full season as a starter. However, his 7th place ranking was the highest he would ever place on the season totals because of what was going on around him. In that 1977 season, Buffalo's Joe Ferguson led the league with 2,803 yards, roughly in line with the past several years' leaders at that point. In the year of Joe Flacco's birth, Jaworski threw for 3,450 yards and was still 700 behind Dan Marino's 4,137. And even that paled in comparison to the season before, when Marino became the first quarterback to ever throw for 5,000 yards, totaling 5,084 in all.
Now, we've alluded to there being an explosion in offensive mastery in the coming years. So what is it that we can chalk this spate of skyrocketing statistics up to? Admittedly, there are some very good players right now, like that Dan Marino guy we just mentioned. But what's changing the nature of the position in this particular moment in history is not the players so much as it is the rulebook as a whole. And part of the reason for that is something called the World Football League. The World Football League, or WFL for short, was indeed a short-lived pro league, lasting about a season and a half from 1974 to 1975. In case you were wondering, the Birmingham Americans won the only ever WFL championship. They no longer existed by the second season. But while the league itself didn't last very long, a couple of notable changes to the rules of gridiron football made the journey from the WFL rulebook into the NFL's own. 1978, in fact, saw a number of NFL rule changes that affected offense. The goalposts were moved 10 yards back to the very end of the field, making pass plays easier within the end zone since players didn't need to navigate dangerous metal bars. In addition, with all kicks now being 10 yards further, settling for a field goal was less incentivized than before. Another change was regarding offensive line play. Previously, they were limited to the chicken wing style of pass protection. Offensive linemen were now able to get some elbow room and stretch their arms out while maintaining the pocket, while the penalty for what few instances still counted as offensive holding went from 15 to just 10 yards. But more important than any of those, more important than changing coaches' red zone playbooks and mentality, more important than changing how offensive linemen fundamentally functioned, was that instance of cross-pollination from the WFL. For years, the NFL's Rule 8, which concerns forward passes and all related matters, stated in Section 4 that bumping, or specifically chunking, of wide receivers by defensive players anywhere within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage was fully legal. In an attempt for their upstart enterprise to provide more high-flying action, the WFL shrunk that down to 3.
And it worked. Tony Adams at the time, the recent draft pick by the San Diego Chargers who is now starting for the Southern California Sun, would in 20 games throw for 3,905 yards, equivalent to about 195 per game. A number that only 2 quarterbacks would manage that year in the NFL despite the massive gap in offensive talent at both quarterback and receiver. Having seen this, the NFL decided to, much like a kick soaring through the uprights, split the difference. Rule 8, Section 4 was amended to define illegal contact as any chunking contact taking place beyond 5 yards from the line of scrimmage. Now, quarterbacks had more time to throw, and the people they were throwing to had become significantly more untouchable. These rules didn't just change quarterback stats, they changed the fundamental relationship between quarterback play and team success. The guys under center were now more than ever at the center of the sport's entire universe. In the 20 years that the AP NFL MVP was handed out from 1957 until 1978 when the new rules went into effect, 11 out of 20 of the awards were given to a quarterback. Definitely the majority, but not overwhelmingly so. In the 47 years since then, 35 of them have been won by quarterbacks, nearly 74%, with only 4 of the 23 awards awarded in the 2000s finding themselves in the hands of anyone who isn't having the ball snapped to them. This was the beginning of a very literal arms race, and it would continue to play out throughout Flacco's life and his career. Speaking of things beginning, we now venture back across the Delaware River from Philly to Audubon, where a young Flacco is taking flight. Joe's now a 15-year-old sophomore and perhaps benefits from a touch of nepotism, as family friend and Audubon coach Mark Deal elevates him to the Green Wave varsity squad full-time. First 2 years under Deal didn't go particularly well, and with a round of budget cuts that come after Joe's junior year, Mark gets the raw end of the deal when he loses his in-school job, forcing a move to nearby Gateway Regional High's coaching staff instead, and leaving the Green Wave. For a quarterback from a small-town high school in a region not exactly known as a football talent hotbed, a coaching change right before your senior year could end up disastrous, especially when the prior coach had a strong personal relationship off the field with you. And that's disastrous for any hopes of making the leap to the college level, but potentially just as disastrous just for playtime, given the overall underwhelming performance of the Green Wave the past 2 years. Thankfully, though, former assistant and newly minted coach Ralph Shivo had seen enough to know that Joe was far from the problem with the team. If anything, Joe was what they needed to lean into more. They needed to let his freak Flacco fly.
For a number of years to this point, Audubon High, like many high schools nationwide, had run some variation of what is known as the single wing or wing T offense. The origin of this is, relative to the history of the sport, an ancient innovation that came from the convergence of the forward pass coming into vogue and Pop Warner himself getting to coach maybe the greatest athlete of all time, Jim Thorpe. In an effort to more easily get eligible receivers downfield for these nifty passes that were all the rage, an unbalanced offensive line was set up with 4 total backs. Now, this was still another of those truly alien looks from the early 20th century in terms of how a play would actually unfold. Furthest back and most often receiving the snap in this variation of players was the tailback, who would then be used as the primary ball handler for passing plays, with a fullback available to rush and a quarterback there to block, of all things. Finally, the all-important wingback would line out wide to the end of the offensive line as the wide receiver position slowly took form in front of their very eyes. This was meant to be a deceptive play in terms of being able to disguise the blocking and intended ball handler. But with all of this being so early in the evolution of the sport, it didn't take long for it to become one of the bedrock formations from which others would spring. Since those primordial games, with the terms being used for positioning evolving more into actual positions, different playbooks began to flow out of the original formation. In particular, one such iteration, called the Wing T, from the trio of Delaware Blue Hen coaches David Nelson, Tubby Raymond, and Ted Kempski, was so eminently teachable that it became the go-to starter set for high schools just like Audubon under Mark Deal.
The thing about the system, though, is that largely it didn't ask much of its quarterbacks. There weren't many reads to make. There weren't many routes to choose between. The simple-to-pick-up nature meant that it lacked complexity in many ways, which can be seen as both a feature and a flaw. Ralph Shivo, upon his elevation, knew that given the 6'5", 200-pound quarterback with a grenade launcher at his disposal, running a simple wing T offense was a misallocation of resources bordering on criminal. Instead, his only directive of Flacco that senior year with the Green Wave was to let it fly. And let it fly he did. Like a verdant tsunami, Flacco crashed into the record books for the state of New Jersey, with a number of those records coming in a game that perfectly illustrates the Joe Flacco experience that season. Late in the season, Flacco led the Green Wave in a matchup against defending Colonial Conference Liberty Division powerhouse West Deptford. Joe had actually squared off against the same team in his very first taste of varsity action at the very tail end of his freshman year. Former coach Deal described his demeanor in that game as so nervous you could hear his knees locking from the sideline. If any nerves around this matchup remained 3 years later, he did a great job of hiding them, as he set state records for passing attempts with 55, completions with 37, and yards with 471. Throwing 3 touchdowns and adding 2 more on the ground, the young quarterback did everything and more that you could possibly ask of him.
The West Deptford Eagles won by a final score of 62-37. Go Birds!
Despite weekly performances like this by Flacco, Audubon went 4-6 his senior season. Quarterback is by far the most important position on the field, regardless of level, but it's not the only one. And the problem at Audubon is there were maybe 500 total students with which Shivo could try and fill all those other roster spots. Coach recalls having a bunch of 5'8", 5'9", 5'10" guys who, in his own words, ran great routes. And that is exactly the kind of fate praise that you would give to a roster where, also by his own admission, not a single person on the team ran under a 4.9 40 on either side of the ball. It's the high school version of a bench player, making all the right plays on special teams. So despite Joe getting his name in the record books, his name was not on the short list for any of the more prestigious college football programs' senior graduation. Rivals.com listed him as a 3-star recruit, and had him ranked as just the 39th best prospect in the nation for his class. Offers came in from the likes of Akron, UCF, and some more local options with Temple and Rutgers. But Flacco was so unprepared he wasn't even sure how to navigate receiving a scholarship from the Scarlet Knights, and with him being the oldest in the family and the first to go through this, neither did his parents. For a family like the Flaccos that had to this point been so thoroughly tied to the South Jersey region, maybe there would have been a certain pastoral charm to him remaining near home with either of those two I-95 programs. But it doesn't feel like a particularly hot take to say that Temple and Rutgers, even then, were about as far down the food chain as FBS programs go. But thankfully, another set of eyes had found some scouting video of Flacco's senior year at Audubon under Shivo. One Matt Williamson saw footage of Flacco's arm strength and began immediately banging the drum for his program to reach out. It didn't take long for him to convince his boss, Walt Harris, to offer Joe a scholarship that would bring him to a city steeped in the tradition of gritty AFC North football that he would come accustomed to. A city in which over the next 20 years he would have some of the biggest and most memorable moments of his career. The Steel City of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Joe Flacco is ready to become a Pitt Panther. Time to go to college. Elite is a production of Remember That Guy. Written, researched, and recorded by James Lensweiler, Justin Diaz, and Xavier Perez. All music is provided by RTG's musical director Don Ham, and sources for additional audio and all of our research can be found in the episode descriptions. More information on Elite and all things RTG related can be found at bit.ly/rememberthatguy, all one word, all lowercase. If you've enjoyed the show, please consider rating, reviewing, and sharing it. Word of mouth is our best, and only, sponsor. Until next time, thanks for listening.